We are speaking with Arsen Ostrovsky, the head of the Australian Israel Jewish Affairs Council's Sydney office. So, how is the Jewish community viewing President Herzog's visit, which comes, of course, in the wake of the deadly Bondi Beach terrorist attack?
Yeah, thank you for having me on. Look, I think for the incredibly vast, overwhelming majority of the Jewish community here in Australia, we are very much excited and looking forward to welcoming the president, especially at this moment, which is one, I think, of quite immense significance for the Jewish community here, which is still very much reeling after the Bondi massacre just last December, in which 15 people were murdered. But we're also looking at this very much as an opportunity to restart and re-engage the relationship between Australia and Israel, one which over the last few years become increasingly strained. And hopefully this visit by the president presents an opportunity to turn a new leaf.
Now, you yourself survived that deadly attack that day. Tell us what happened to you on that day.
So we had actually just relocated back to Australia, where I grew up. I actually grew up in Bondi, but had been living in Israel for the last 13 plus years. So we relocated here back with my wife and kids, and we were at Bondi that evening for the first night of Hanukkah. There was so many other families, young children, elderly were there as well to enjoy the Hanukkah festival, to enjoy the first night. And then the shooting started. My wife and children and I had just been in separate places at that moment when it began, and I got hit when I stood up to run towards them, and I got hit in the head, and the blood immediately started gushing out. It was like a tap, someone, as if they just opened the tap. Look, ultimately I survived. The doctor said it was a miracle. It was millimeters between life and death. Unfortunately and very sadly, 15 other people did not survive, including a 10-year-old girl, Matilda, including a Holocaust survivor, and many others. But look, at the end of the day, we cannot change what happened, but we can and we must learn from it to ensure that it never happens again.
That attack, of course, did not come in isolation. It followed a wave of virulent anti-Israel protests with clear elements of anti-Semitism, attacks on Jewish property, a wave of anti-Semitism in Australia following October the 7th. The government was under intense pressure, particularly from the Jewish community, to act, to do something in response to the attack and what preceded it. Tell our listeners what the government has done, and are you satisfied with that?
Look, I think you're right to put this in context, that over the last 2 and a bit years, certainly since the October 7th attacks by Hamas, Australia has seen an alarming and I would say almost unabated really explosion and surge in anti-Semitism. It's no longer on the fringes. It is mainstream. It is in the digital arena. It is in the arts and cultural arena. It is on the streets with marches calling to globalize the intifada. It is very much in the media and the public discourse. And I think what we saw in Bondi was the deadly consequences, quite frankly, of what happens when this hatred is left unchecked and is done so despite warning after warning after warning from Jewish leaders and in the community here about the danger of anti-Semitism being allowed to fester. And what happened in Bondi was this deadly manifestation of that. But I think what Bondi attack has also reinforced is something very important, and it's that anti-Semitism is not merely a problem just for Jews. Even though Jews were attacked that day in Bondi, it is very much an assault on the very social fabric of Australia. It is no longer a left-wing issue or a right-wing issue, but it is an Australian issue.
We know the government has taken actions on gun control, which was already quite strict in your country. Have they taken action on anti-Semitism?
Look, I think there is certainly a lot of scope to be critical of the government in the last 2 years, and a number of the actions they've taken, which not only disregarded, I think, numerous warnings rising anti-Semitism, but in some cases perhaps vis-a-vis their policy on Israel and the war in Gaza, perhaps informed it in some circumstances. But I think that following the attack in Bondi, we have seen some very welcome and strong response from the government. We've seen the Royal Commission created, which will look into not only what happened in Bondi, but equally, and if not even more importantly, about how it was allowed to happen, which is critical in order to learn from what happened in Bondi. We have seen legislation passed just the other week on hate groups, which is important, and I think we've also seen very much across the spectrum of Australian society speak out and stand up, which is something perhaps that had been missing for a long time. So I think there's certainly a number of welcome steps, if albeit perhaps somewhat overdue, but certainly necessary now in order to move forward.
Now, a number of protests are planned against President Herzog during the visit. Are you concerned about this? Do you think these protests should be cancelled, should be banned by the government?
Look, I'll be quite frank with you. These protests are grotesque and defensible. Yes, freedom of speech is crucial in Australia's democracy, as it is very much so, of course, in Israel, but it is not. It is not a license to break the law. It is not a license to harass, to intimidate, or to spread hatred, especially so soon after Bondi, which remains deeply, deeply painfully raw for the community, and at a time when there is already a ceasefire in Gaza. I would also add, I think that a lot of the people, the very same ones that are calling President Herzog's visit divisive, are very much also the same people who have helped actually fuel this toxic atmosphere that we find ourselves in through relentless vilification of anyone who supports Israel's right to exist and defend itself, which is the overwhelming majority of the Jewish community. So those that are calling his visit divisive, I think, are in the fringe, a very loud fringe, but insofar as the Jewish community is concerned, we are excited. We will be welcoming the President, and as I know, will many leaders across the country, including the Prime Minister and the Governor-General who had invited him.
Finally, I read one report that an organisation called the Jewish Council of Australia has called for President Herzog to be arrested. Presumably this is one of those extremist fringe groups that in no way represents the bulk of Australian Jewry.
No, this is a small fringe extremist group. It does not speak for the majority of Australian Jews who are proudly Zionists, who are welcoming the President visit and who stand with Israel in the face of terror that we've seen since October 7th and certainly in the ongoing days today. But the overwhelming majority of Australian Jewish community are excited to welcome the President who arrives tomorrow.